invited to talk to a military audience here in Norway. I started working with you in the mid-70s when the UK Special Forces were tasked to develop a northern role. And I worked very closely with a wonderful man called Admiral Wheatfeld, who came from a very long line of naval people. And at that time, he was Commander Northern Norway. So I have a very long history of working with Norwegians. You also may be slightly worried by the fact that an elderly army man should be talking to what is predominantly an Air Force audience. I actually started off my military career as a pilot. And I spent 2 years flying with the Royal Air Force and did about 200 or 300 hours flying with them. And at the end of it, one day, my instructor tapped me on the shoulder and said, Michael, I do think the world would be a safer place if you kept your feet firmly on the ground from henceforth. So it was inevitable that I joined the army. But equally, you may wonder why someone of my age and experience, and I'm going to talk about wars which were happening before the younger people in the audience were alive, whether it's in any way relevant. Well, of course it's relevant, because the dynamics of command in battle are enduring. And the sort of challenges that I faced as a junior officer and a senior officer, and the challenge that you face and will face, both in peace and war, are exactly the same and have been the same throughout the ages. So I hope that what I'm going to say will ring a few bells with you, strike a few chords. Of course, the subject of mission command has never been more important than it is now. The dynamics of the new form of war that we're being confronted with, a loosely termed hybrid war, where you are conflating conventional warfare with unconventional warfare, with psychological operations, with information, fast-moving information battle, means it's extremely hard for anybody, let alone the higher command, to read the dynamics of a battlefield. Units and people will be very dispersed. You will be in fast-moving, confused situations. And the only way of managing battle and managing command inevitably will be through the process and the application of mission command and understanding its principles. But of course, those principles today, with the compression between the strategic levels and the operational levels and the tactical levels, which have been pushed very closely together, plus the facilities that are afforded by high-speed communications, and of course the growing aversion to taking risks in peacetime, make it inevitable in some ways that commanders want to micromanage. Yesterday I was at the British Army Chief of General Staff's conference for retired officers, which he holds every year. And when it came to question time, I asked him what his views were on the erosion of mission command in the British Army. And I got an acknowledgement from me that it was indeed a great threat. But I then asked later some junior officers who were supporting the conference what they thought, and they gave me an entirely different view. They said that because the career paths of commanding officers today are threatened all the time by litigation, by making mistakes, the commanding officers tend to sit on the backs of junior officers today in the British Army more and more. And that is a big mistake, because minds brought up to attend to the sort of minutiae of detail which they're being asked to do in order to assure themselves against risk, scarcely make the psychological processes which you need in time of war. And so I think what I'm going to do is talk about some of the experiences I've had where I've had to use mission command, and it has proved vital in the success of the operation that I became involved with, and without which certainly I would not be here today in a number of cases. I shall start off with Bosnia, the conflict that took place between 1992 and 1995. I was the chief of the United Nations force in Bosnia throughout the whole of 94 and the beginning of 95. And when I arrived in that mission, I discovered that the mission was in decline. In fact, Boutros Ghali, the Secretary of State, was going to withdraw that mission in the spring, in April, and I'd arrived in January. And the reason is that the peacekeepers were demoralized, the amount of aid that they were being able to deliver in that three-sided civil war was falling, they were taking casualties, the troop-contributing nations were threatening to withdraw their troops, and so in the end, Boutros Ghali said, well, we must terminate the... Yet, there were 2.7 million people who were dependent on that United Nations aid every day. And of course, it was in a climate where the temperature in the winter drops rather like it does here, down to minus 20 degrees. So it was vital that that mission continued. My first job in establishing and applying the principles of mission command was to go to New York and redefine the purposes of that mission, which were, and it was agreed between the troop-contributing nations, Madeleine Albright, who was present at the meeting, and Lavrov, who you still see today, the foreign minister of Russia, who was at that time a junior man working in New York for the United Nations. We all got together and we redefined the mission, which was to continue with the aid program, to reduce the level of conflict by our presence, and finally to stop that war from spreading. I then went back with that very clear set of priorities and wrote out a set of orders which were understandable to the people who were going to work for me. There were 23,500 young peacekeepers dispersed across that country, which was in, as I say, a three-sided civil war where much of the infrastructure had broken down. And therefore it was essential that I used mission command. They were going to be deployed to remote places where the communications were going to be bad, but they still had to get on and do the job. They knew how to do the job, they just hadn't been given the facilities or the structure in which to deliver. They were passionately keen on succeeding, so it was never a problem to motivate people. Once I had given a clear set of orders, and incidentally, my chief of staff, who was a British brigadier, said to me, I'm afraid you can't do that. You cannot give orders in a United Nations. You have to do everything by consultation and by agreement. There are no such thing as orders in United Nations operations. I sacked him and replaced him with an extremely effective young Dutchman who understood what I was trying to do. The next thing was to organize, and that incidentally lifted the morale just of an awful lot of the peacekeepers who we'd been working with. The next thing to do was to get us a structure right. At the time I arrived, the United Nations headquarters was based in an ex-Olympic ski hotel, 40 miles from the center of gravity of that war, which was in Sarajevo. In Sarajevo, a city under siege, being shelled continuously, under sniper fire. There was no electricity, no running water, rations and food were extremely short. And yet that's where the United Nations headquarters should be, in the center of gravity. I moved it, a small headquarters, into the middle of Sarajevo. Kislyak, where the main headquarters had been, I closed down. Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General, the head of the peacekeeping department at the time, later became Secretary General, said to me, General Rose, you can't do that. Everybody tries to close that down. Everybody wants to have a regional command based on brigade headquarters around the country, but you won't get them to move from Kislyak because they have the national red card, and if they waive the red card, you can't go against that. Well, my response was quite simple. I turned off the electricity, I turned off the water, I shut down the flow of alcohol, which seemed to be the main supply going into Kislyak, and a lot of the people, the seniors left. And the people who knew how to and wanted to do the job dispersed to the regional headquarters, which I co-located with the United Nations High Commission for Refugee offices. So we had a hatch between the military side, literally slide a hatch. If there was a problem there, it could be resolved by opening the hatch and asking the military, or vice versa. The military would discover where there was a crisis. They would tell the UNHCR, and the two lots were working together. If you look at the graphs of the improvement in the delivery of aid from February onwards, when people got it, it started to increase. And by the end of '94, all the tonnages of aid which were required to be delivered by the World Health Organization were being delivered. And it was all done through mission command. I'll give you an example of how it worked. we heard from the UNHCR that an enclave called Magli, which is kind of north and west of Sarajevo, an isolated area in a valley, had not had an aid convoy because the Serbs had surrounded it and were shooting at anybody who tried to go through. They were desperate to get hold of to put a convoy through and to resupply that area. The people were dying of starvation. There was no fuel for the hospitals or schools to heat them, etc. Of course, in military world, you do not go blundering into a situation like that. So we had to put in special force units to go in there and identify the best way to get these convoys in. And I chose Norwegian Air, who flew helicopters for the United Nations in Bosnia to do the job. The first approach they made, a covert approach over the mountains and into Magli, they got fired at by SAM-7 missiles. Their orders from Norway were not to engage in any kind of military activity if it was hostile to that level. But they pulled off, but the commander of the mission, called Slinder, Captain Slinder, he decided to do it anyway because it was so important. Mission command. He believed in the mission. He felt he could do it. He ignored his orders from on high, and he managed to evade the SAM-7 missiles that came out at him, landed the special forces lot, and on the way out, he had more SAM-7s fired at him, but he got away with it. As a result of the risks he took, conscious risk, we were able to bring in convoys, and the result, of course, was that many people live today who would not have been alive if it hadn't been for that application of mission command. On another occasion, Colonel Heinrichsen of the Danish army tried to call down airstrikes when a convoy had been stopped and was being mortared. The airstrike never happened. He misunderstood the situation, and he gave an interview to the press saying that the UN was a failed organization because it was unable to protect its convoys properly. What had actually happened, and of course that went viral. He gave that to CNN. In no time at all, we had Madeleine Albright in the United Nations repeating that the UN was a broken mission. It was not. Kofi Annan and in fact Boutros Ghali and my own boss in Zagreb all called for his resignation and said, you must sack him, he must go. He's damaged the image of this mission so much. I took a different view. He was a young colonel. He'd arrived newly in the job. He was a good guy, and he just misunderstood the situation. I told my chain of command above that I couldn't sack him, and nor indeed could they, because he was actually the contingent chief. And any person can sack anyone within the Danish contingent was him, and he was unlikely to be sacking himself. Which I explained to them. I then went and had a quiet word with him and said, look, you, through the best of intentions, you've made a terrible mistake. You've caused a lot of embarrassment, but nevertheless, we're putting trust in you to get it right next time. And he went on ahead and became a very successful contingent. On one occasion, where we were using the Danish tanks to pass the convoy through, he and his unit, I think, destroyed 5 Serb tanks in one engagement, more tanks than the Danish army had destroyed in the Second World War, or that unit had destroyed in the Second World War. So that shows that you have to have trust in the people, and if they make mistakes, particularly in peace, you have to let them make mistakes, learn from them, and back them up. Obviously, if he'd done something absolutely criminal, he'd have gone overnight or stupid. But you have to put faith in people in the front line. At the end of the day, the war in Bosnia was undermined, would have succeeded, and was on a trajectory of success had it not been for the Americans undermining the mission by arming the one side, the Muslims. Incidentally, talking about mission command, I had this yesterday on extremely high authority. The Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army and Armed Forces gave the order to withdraw from Syria on Twitter. The Pentagon heard about it on Twitter. Clearly, President Trump doesn't understand either the principles or the application of mission command. And somebody should teach him how to do it better. Of course, in these sort of circumstances, it's very difficult sometimes to turn the overall strategic intent into practical application on the ground. And I was taught this lesson once by Margaret Thatcher when I was the commandant of our staff college at Camberley. And she said to me, and it was in 1992 when the Balkans were on fire, and everything seemed to be crashing. Dubrovnik was being shelled, etc. And as I came in to get lunch, she said to me, General Rose, what do you think we should be doing about the Balkans? Well, I gave her all the perceived political wisdoms of the day, which was there was no national interest in the United Kingdom getting involved in the Balkans. It wasn't, to quote Disraeli, one of our former Prime Ministers, worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier. The resources you'd have to contribute would be limitless in terms of human life and resources. And there was no clear exit strategy, and the best thing we could do was to give them beans and blankets. Well, she gave me a 40-minute reply, which started off by saying she never thought she'd hear a British Army general talking in such negative and pathetic terms. And she proceeded to tell me about what we should be doing, which was bombing all the bridges over the River Drina, which is where all the Serb artillery and tanks were coming, bombing the JNA, the headquarters of the regular Yugoslav army outside Belgrade, bombing the power stations around Belgrade, etc. So you can imagine I took this very much to heart from a great lady like Margaret Thatcher. So when the Secretary of State for Defence was coming in a week later and asked the inevitable question, well, General Rose, what do you think we should be doing about the Balkans? I replied, a much shorter but equally passionate reply, it's quite clear to me, Secretary of State, we should be bombing those bridges, bombing those power stations. He gave an equally horrified look and said, my God, what have we done to promote a lunatic like you to teach the young officer? Well, obviously, and this is something you'll have to face up to, the answers are always going to be between the two extremes. But the message that I've always carried throughout my life is that let the guys in the front line who know best how to do it get on and do the job themselves. I'll take another very short example because I don't want to overstep my 20 minutes. If you take the Iranian embassy siege, which happened in 1980 in London, when a group of terrorists took over the Iranian embassy in London, and I was the commanding officer of the SS, and so we were ordered ultimately to go in and rescue the hostages. Right at the start, there were 3 levels of command established. There was the strategic level in Whitehall, the government. Margaret Thatcher chaired the meeting sometimes, but mainly handed over to the Ministry of Interior, the Home Secretary. There was the operational level, which I was sat in. There were only 3 of us in there. The head of the police, who had been nominated to do it, me, and the civil servant who represented the Ministry of Interior. 3 of us only. And then there were the guys on the ground. Right at the start, Margaret Thatcher said to me through the system, what constitutes the grounds for attacking the building, the Iranian embassy? One body, I said, one shooting would not constitute the grounds. It may have been a mistake, it may be something, but we're not going to do it. On 2, we will definitely go in. She said, I'll buy that. What are the chances of success, she said. I said, well, about 50 or 60%. I was nudged in the ribs, so I had to up that to 70%. She then passed a message back down, if it goes wrong, you are not to be blamed, or your soldiers. I will take the full blame. And from that moment onwards, we had the absolute confidence that that mission was going to work out, and indeed it did work out extremely well. That gives another example of how the people in senior command have a responsibility to stop the people down below getting the blame if things go wrong, or indeed they have the responsibility to stop the micromanagement, which is inevitable when you see images of President Trump or President Obama sitting in the war cabinet watching live action going on in Iraq, or as it happened the other day in I think, Syria, in Idlib, when they took down al-Baghdadi. But that is exactly how not to do it. Just because you've got the ability to see forward doesn't mean to say you should interfere. In Bosnia, and I'll stop at this note, I refused to take a call from President Clinton. I was in my office, the telephone rang, my aide picked it up, President Clinton on the line. Tell him I'm out. And I left the room immediately. Why did I do that? Because if I had taken taken the call and had a discussion with him, he'd have taken some of my words, and without understanding the context of how I was employing and what we were doing, he'd have gone public, which would have been inevitably wrong, the wrong balance, the wrong emphasis, and that would have completely collapsed the relationship that I'd built up between 16 troop contributing nations and their ambassadors, and all the way up through the United Nations. So I didn't take the call. I think that's probably 20 minutes is enough. I could go on forever.